Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Effective Networking for Business Development, sponsored by the Emory Office of Alumni Engagement. My name is Sarah Baker and I'm the Associate Director of Professional Development here at the Emory Alumni Association. I'm thrilled to be joined by our presenter today, David Kirshenbaum, who's a 1983 graduate of Emory College. I first met David this summer at an Emory Student and Alumni Networking event in Chicago, and after spotting him holding court with literally half the room gathered around him, I knew we had to bring him in for a webinar on networking. So I'll tell you more about David in just a minute, but before we begin, I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. So first, there was a large amount of interest in today's topic, so I wanted to let you all know that today's session will be recorded, and we're going to house it on Emory's YouTube page under our career webinar playlist in case you'd like to revisit it. Secondly, David will be taking some Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type them into the question tab in your GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of the session. So let me tell you a little bit more about David, and then I'll turn it over to him. So David Kirshenbaum has over 30 years of experience in guiding growth-oriented businesses, business development, client and transaction management, and operations and asset management. He currently serves as CEO for Emagispace, where his responsibilities include driving the vision and strategy for this innovative startup that's revolutionizing the construction of interior space across several product categories. Previously, David led growth-oriented, complex operations with an emphasis on real estate development and investment. He excels in building customer-driven organizations that achieve business and strategy goals. Throughout his career, David skillfully managed a diverse set of assets with values in excess of $1 billion through strong and difficult markets and multiple companies. He has in-depth experience with change management and has successfully optimized organization structure to develop high-performing teams. David has overseen rapidly growing entrepreneurial businesses and has a passion for investing. He is currently an individual investor for modular construction, healthy food, IoT, real estate, and high-tech companies. Finally, David serves as a member of 3 private company boards and 2 charitable boards. He's a past chairman of America Needs You Chicago board and spends a good deal of time mentoring any students, other mentors, and staff. Phew. So David, I'm tired just reading your bio. I really don't know how you balance it all, but we're extremely grateful that you've taken the time to be here with us today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all of your hard work over the last couple months. And yes, I did meet Sarah at a Emory networking event, which is part of the theme that we're going to talk about today, which is it's really important to get out there and you just never know who you're going to meet and what it will turn into. And one of the things that came out besides meeting Sarah and getting to know her and her passion for promoting Emory and Emory alumni events is I was able to meet a couple students, a couple of which I am still mentoring today. And I was able to actually connect them to my charitable organization, which is America Needs You. And actually 2 of them, as a result of meeting Sarah and going to that event, are now mentors in the organization, which is just awesome. So I looked at the list and I appreciate everyone's time. I think I'm on the West Coast. I think most of you guys are on your lunch. And I see that 100 or more people have signed up from all walks of life, which I appreciate, all different parts of the country. And just looking through the list, I know that there's probably at least 10 companies that I have some sort of relationship with from the past across my career. And just, one of the themes here is just you never know where a good connection is going to come from. And I see that there's at least one person on this call from New York who works at Ernst & Young. And just a quick story of just being creative and just following through is every month, like most of you, I get the Emory magazine, and I always flip to the back section where I'm looking to see who's had a baby, who got a new job, who got married, and sadly at my age, who's dying. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was flipping through and I noticed that my freshman year Emory roommate from Longstreet had been named the global CEO and chairman of Ernst & Young. His name is Mark Weinberger. He couldn't be with us today, but he runs a very large company. And seeing that he was now in this position, and at the time I was in a business development role, I reached out to him, and even though we hadn't talked in some 30 years, and even though no business resulted, I was able to reach out to get in touch with him, and we've maintained a relationship ever since. So just, a little tidbit like that in the Emory magazine led to what could have been a substantial business relationship, but it was rekindling a friendship, and obviously having someone at that level of industry is a good contact to have. So again, thanks to everyone for attending. I am just a quick background in terms of, Sarah just read this. My career has been split between more operations and of late business development. So early in my career, I was a practicing attorney. I've had some roles with business development, but the heart of my career was much more in operations. And it was just in my last two jobs where I've spent a lot of time in the business development and the networking world. And I've always tried to maintain a very strong network. And I think one of the messages I would give to everyone, because I know that most of the people on this call are younger, are graduates of 2000 and later, and some 2010 and later. And the relationship, like my relationship with Mark Weinberger, which started in 1979, was rekindled in 2011. So it's really important to think about the people that are around you, and today's Longstreet roommate could turn out to be the CEO of a gigantic corporation and a public company. So it's always important to consider that. So there you can see my bio, and I think just from a career perspective, I'd say I've hired hundreds and hundreds of people, and I think it's really important just from a message perspective, because I think in today's day and age, people aren't as linear as they have been in the past in terms of their careers, staying at one place for 30, 35, 40 years. Always important to, grow your skill set, and to be aware of your skill set, to have the ability to pivot. And ultimately, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, it's important to be able to give prospective employers and prospective clients what your value proposition is, whether that's personal or whether that's on behalf of your company. But it's really important to have a very cogent elevator speech that you're able to morph into 1-minute versions, 3-minute versions, and 5-minute versions. And that becomes really effective, because there's a lot of people that I've run into that are unable to express what their skill set is or what exactly they're selling. So if talking about networking and business development, if a person is in business development, exclusively, that's one thing. There's a lot of industries where, or a lot of jobs where business development is one of 10 different job responsibilities. In my last job, I was basically 80 or 90% on the business development side, and it was very much an eat what you kill environment. So the key there is establishing relationships that will ultimately lead to a transaction and lead to revenue. And in my old job, I was able to be successful across multiple lines of business and types of transactions across the platform. Again, this is more career advice than anything else, but to the greatest extent possible, it's always beneficial that you don't get yourself boxed into a very narrow realm. I jokingly call it the assistant vice president of staplers. In my old job, I was able to effectively communicate our 4 different lines of business, both from a business development and an operational perspective. And by being able to do that, I was able to get a much wider array of business. So I think it's important to understand your business. It's important to understand the nuances of your business. And I think a critical fact that led to success for me in business development was I came at it from an operational perspective. I knew the guts of how transactions worked and what a buyer's interest was, what a seller's interest was, what a lender's interest was, et cetera. And because my career has been, non-linear, I had the perspective of a lawyer, of a lender, of a developer, of an investor, all these different things. So when I spoke to prospective clients, I could give advice from any angle on that prism. And being able to do that got people to not so much like me, but trust my opinions. And a lot of business development is developing that trust, developing that certainty that this person can get my deal done. So one other thing that I would add in terms of those who are interested in a business development career is, in my experience in real estate, and I think to a degree in law, there are a number of circumstances where you're working really hard and you're just getting one single transaction. The gold standard in terms of business development is to develop a relationship so that you can get repeat business. If you can get someone in the door and wow them with either your product or your service or whatever it might be, and that leads to, hey, it's nice that you did one deal for me, but here's 10 more that you can do. The gift that keeps on giving. Then it becomes a function of maintaining the relationship, maintaining the excellence in terms of whether it's the product or the service. But certainly, among targets, which we'll talk about in a minute, someone who can provide you with repeat business is someone that you should definitely be coveting. Flipping over to the next page. So there's a strategy around all of this. And part of that is, as the slide says, relationship targeting and formation. So, it's nice that if you're in business development and you want to have General Motors as the client, but can you find the person at General Motors who has the ability to award you business? So part of the trick is to figure out, okay, who am I fishing for? Who would be the optimal person or people that I can go after that would potentially be able to generate some business? And then within the company context, you have, who is the target? So it's GM. And then who is the target within the target? Who has the pen? Who has the ability to give you a purchase order? So it's nice that you have a relationship with 800 people at GM, but if you don't have a relationship with the 801st person who can give you the business, then, what have you done? So again, there's a strategy around all of this. And one of the things that and I'll tell some stories along the way here. One of my major bank clients was BMO Harris, which probably took me 2 or 3 years to capture as a client. And I would say that I probably met along the way 7 to 10 people who were quote unquote the wrong people, until the 10th person introduced me to the 11th, and the 11th said, oh, we could totally use someone like you. So, again, another important lesson here is being strategic, being persistent, and continuously trying to find that person that you can establish the relationship with that will ultimately award the business. And then you as individuals need to be prepared to act and pursue. That becomes really important because there's a level of persistence and there's a level of aggressiveness that is needed to be successful, in my opinion. And going back to the third bullet point, is finding advocates, finding decision makers within an organization, and sometimes it's as simple as getting a warm introduction. If you've identified XYZ person at General Motors and you don't know them personally, but it turns out you play golf with someone who they went to college with, and that person can engineer an introduction, and there's a warm introduction, then all of a sudden, you may have a much better chance at getting that business. The other thing I would say, and this goes back to the Mark Weinberger example, is to start early. Early in my career, I worked for a real estate developer who became the toast of the town in Chicago. And he used as his main outside counsel someone who he had been to college with and was law school roommates with. So you can't always know what your roommates are going to do or how your friends are going to turn out from a career perspective. But you want, and this guy's name, who was my boss, was named Bruce Abrams. You want to know Bruce Abrams when he's doing his first 3-flat. Or when he's doing his first or second deal, because by the time he becomes what he did was, kind of the next Sam Zell in Chicago. He's established key relationships with lawyers, with bankers, with appraisers, with mortgage companies, all these other things. It's not to say that you can't dislodge any of those things, but especially you young people, the person who is, the third assistant vice president today may end up being the chief operating officer in the year 2030. And if you can establish a relationship with that person and you can judge that that person is going to rise through the ranks and you maintain your relationship through the years, when that person does become the COO and does put themselves in a position to award business and the like, you'll now have a 10, 15-year relationship. So it's important to look to your right, look to your left, and look to peers who are going to grow in their careers and who could at some point, in spite of or because of your friendship, be able to award business to you because you've developed this relationship. So moving on to the next page, there's a number of different avenues to try to get in front of people. And it's very important that one be strategic and have a plan when you are going about to try to meet new people, get out of your comfort zone, and establish some relationship. So here are just, some ideas, and the title of this slide is ABC, always be connecting or networking. And I've had a number of people say that, that I'm a very good networker and I'm the best networker they know, and that I've got a widespread network. And it's something that I have worked at for, 30 years. Being in business development is all about having a really strong network, understanding how the network works together, and seeing if you can put parts of the network together for your own benefit, for your company's benefit, and for their benefit. So in terms of places where you can find folks to meet, obviously you have industry conferences. There's charities and charity boards. So as an example, I'm on 2 charity boards, and as a result of those 2 charity boards, I've had introductions to probably 5 of the largest private equity firms in the country. I've also been introduced to countless people who are there for charitable reasons, but things sometimes turn to business, and sometimes people say, "Oh, you're in the real estate business? Oh, great. Let's talk about this or that." So getting yourself on charity boards, and in a lot of cases, because I know a lot of you folks are young, there are junior boards. Like my organization has a YLB that has 50 people on it, and there are 50 really engaging future superstars. And to be one of those 50 is walking yourself into a great network of people. There are a number of industry parties and events, and now that we're heading toward the Christmas season, tis the season, if you will. And then there are other situations, and I know there's a few lawyers on the list of attendees today. Sometimes just being across the table and doing good work will get you noticed. I would not discount friends, families, and other unlikely sources of leads, and we'll talk about electronics in a second, but literally I have met with and networked people across the world. I once, someone asked for a selfie on the Arc de Triomphe, and it turned into a conversation that almost led to that person's roommate getting hired by us. So my ears are always up for, is there a way to develop this relationship, and can it benefit either me or can it benefit my company? And, will this relationship grow into something over the long term? So one way, and I'll preface the LinkedIn page by saying, one way, actually, before we get to the LinkedIn page, let me just make a couple other comments. So in terms of building a network, again, the scattershot approach doesn't really work. So when I was at my old job, as an example, I had basically 5 or 6 defined buckets of targets of people that meant the most to the business that I was building within that company. In that case, it was lawyers, general counsels who are also lawyers, environmental firms, private equity firms, restructuring firms, retailers, and industrial firms. And from those 7 groups, those were my 7 fishing holes. Sure, I would take random people from other quote unquote buckets, but having those buckets led to an ability to really build strong networks within each of the 7. 7 may be a lot for some people, but I was able to manage that. It's also very important to have regular outreach to your network, and we'll talk about prioritization of the network and continuing to mine for new leads. And then the trick is always, whether it's on LinkedIn or whether it's in a cocktail party, is are you able to engineer a real life meeting? And that was something that was, there's an art to it, of not coming off as being phony, and of, genuinely listening to a person, and being engaging enough and having enough in common where after an exchange of cards and an exchange of conversation, you're able to either ask right there, like, hey, it'd be really great to, meet up for a cup of coffee another day. Most people are open to that. And I made it a habit, and I think that there's a certain amount of discipline here. I made it a habit of, if I went to a cocktail party and met 20 people that night or the next morning before I started my day, those 20 people had emails from me with some sort of note on what we had discussed. And there's a lot of people that go to cocktail parties, get the 20 cards, put them in their pocket, go to sleep, and never follow up. And of those 20 people that I met at a cocktail party, that may have resulted in 5 or 6 meetings, and those 5 or 6 meetings may have led to 1 or 2 relationships. So it's a big funnel, and you're always trying to establish the best relationships that are going to create the most meaningful stream of revenue, if business development is what your objective is. But at the same time, a network can be used for non-financial matters as well, of just being able to get advice or building a personal board of directors and the like. So I think it's important to just kind of understand what the universe of targets you're looking for, and then act accordingly from there. In terms of LinkedIn, I've become, quite the LinkedIn player. I find that LinkedIn, among the social networks, for business purposes, is the best one, relative to a Facebook or something like that. I recommend that everyone have a very strong LinkedIn page, and there's all sorts of information on being at quote unquote 100%, meaning having a picture, having recommendations, having references, telling people what you're about, because in a lot of cases, folks, before they go into an interview or before they go into any sort of business development meeting, they'll look up their counterpart on LinkedIn. And if your page is, from 1999, that's not going to do you much good. So I think, it's like a garden. It needs to be tended to. It needs to be taken care of. And then I would tell you that I have more than 5,600 connections. In reality, I probably know, like I've met them, probably 15% of that number. So if someone calls me and says, hey, David, I see you're connected to Sarah, can you do an introduction? If I know Sarah, I will do that. If I don't know Sarah, if she's in the 85% that I don't really know, but I'm just connected to, then I won't, I will not really do an introduction. And one of the ways that I got to that number of LinkedIn contacts was, for several years when I was in business development, I would spend probably an hour to 2 hours every Sunday going through LinkedIn. There's several functions where you can kind of find people who are in the target category. So if Joe Blow is the general counsel of Sears and I'm connected to Joe Blow, there's a function called People Like Joe. And, there's a list of like 200 general counsels of retail companies. And back in the old days, I would click on people that were of interest to me or my company. And in some cases, they would respond. and in some cases they would not. But I was very aggressive in terms of my outreach. I think there's some lawyers on the phone here. There's rules against, going and doing things like that. But I think, by and large, LinkedIn has been a very good tool. And my whole goal with LinkedIn was to go from some sort of connection to trying to get to a real life meeting, whether in Chicago, which is where I'm from, or some of the cities that I would travel to. So if someone connected with me, I would then reach back and then send them a note and then try to move them from LinkedIn to my work email address and try to get a meeting together. And I've had some really significant relationships come out of LinkedIn, including at my current job, where one of our most significant strategic partners invited me to connect. And, I looked at his profile, and it made perfect sense. And we've since become friends, and have done several deals together. So LinkedIn can be quite a good tool. Going on to the next page. One last thing. If in business development you get to travel, in some cases you're covering just one city or one region. One tip that I give is I would reach out to people in the categories in other cities, and I would literally maintain a list. X is from Boston, Y is from Dallas, Z is from Seattle, A, B, C is from, these various cities, and literally kept a list. And when if I went to Dallas, I would look through my Rolodex and see, who do I know in Dallas? If I've got a meeting with client A, but then I've got 7 hours to fill, I'm going to look to see all the people I know in Dallas, and some of those people are going to be from LinkedIn. And I'm going to say, hey, remember we met on LinkedIn, and let's get together. And I've met with and formed serious relationships with a number of people as a result of meeting them on LinkedIn, making it a real life relationship, and then meeting them in person and then following up. So here on the next slide, we have a couple important tips that can help you, because I think this can be very daunting to people. So one is to try to write down some details of a conversation immediately after you have it. I would typically do this on a business card, and that would be my cue to follow up the next day to say, hey, it was nice talking about the Yankees. We're both big fans. And, people like to know that you've remembered them or remembered a detail. It's important to be a conversationalist and have something to say. When I was in my Emory days, I was painfully shy. I've since come out of my shell a bit. But it's very important that you are able to be a strong conversationalist. You need to have something to say. You need to be able to contribute to conversations. You can see, today with the divisive nature of our politics, I would generally, and I've gotten myself into it a couple times by just saying, hey, how about those tariffs? And, it's just avoid politics at all costs. You're really only going to get yourself in trouble, and you don't want to lose business or not have network opportunities because someone is with the other party or someone has a real strong opinion one way or the other. It's also important to be a good listener. One of the strategies I used when I was engaging with people, especially when it got to the level of them wanting a service, is to have, instead of me giving my elevator pitch first and saying, here's what I'm about or here's what we're about, it would be, tell me about yourself, tell me about what problems you have, and tell me how I can help to solve it. So I would generally let a person blather on for 15 minutes while making mental notes of the ways that I could solve their problem. And even though I had, let's say, 20 different services to sell, I would zero in on the 3 or 4 where they said, oh, I've got a property with this issue or that issue. And I said, oh, by the way, we're the biggest player of blah, 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 blah. And not sell them the other 15 things that they didn't care about, but zero in. So get them to tell you the problem, listen, and then react to it. And then, ultimately, you can go to a million cocktail parties, but at some point you have to steer the conversation toward what you need and basically how you can help. And this goes back to also having an effective elevator pitch of varying lengths, because ultimately someone's going to say, why should I hire you? What will your company do for me? And a lot of people do not have the ability to effectively communicate the answer to that question. And it's very important that not only in business development, not only do you have a good ear and a good ability to match a person's problems for the services or products you're selling, but also an ability to close, because you have to ultimately ask for the business, and you need to have a closer's mentality of like trying to get the deal, trying to push someone over the edge, trying to have them, give you that purchase order. In terms of, I saw a number of questions that were sent in, and thank you to everyone for sending in those questions, and thank you to Sarah for getting them organized. It's really important, and I know this sounds daunting and a full-time job, and it sort of is, but it's important and it can be very beneficial to your career. But following up and staying in touch is vitally important. Again, there's a million people that go to cocktail parties, get a million cards, walk away, and that's the end of it. It's a numbers game, and I can't tell you how many solid relationships came out of me being able to send that follow-up note, me being able to have that cup of coffee, me being able to determine, is there a relationship here? Is this worth pursuit for both of us? Should this person be my friend? Should this person be a business contact? Should this person be somewhere in between? So there's a number of ways that you can stay on top of people and stay in touch with people. So there's birthdays, there's holidays, there's things that are happening in the news. If, as an example, I have a friend who's the CFO of a public company. Anytime I see that public company is in the news, their earnings, they've been bought, they're getting sold, they've sold a division, whatever it might be, I'll pop them a note. Hey, Steve, I saw that you're doing X. Congratulations on Y. I just saw that a friend of mine had raised $1 billion fund, and I read it in an article, and I literally sent him a one-line email. Hey, congratulations, saw that you raised $1 billion. You want people to know that you're thinking about them and that you care about them. And it's sincere, because people like to know that they're being thought of. So, hopefully everyone's reading the newspaper, and you're keeping track. You don't have to necessarily keep track of everyone's birthday, but there's a number of different ways to just kind of keep people front of mind. So I would always, read the news. I read a couple newspapers a day. And if I saw that there was a person I knew who was at a company and something was happening at that company, either it was funny or something that they would enjoy, or maybe they're a baseball fan, whatever it might be. Like as an example, today in the Wall Street Journal, there's an article on the front page about my industry. And it's kind of a funny article, and I sent it to several people and just like, hey, by the way, did you see this about privacy pods? And it gets a conversation going, and it lets people know that you're thinking about them. So we talked about the city list, which is keeping a list of, folks that in different cities. And I think it's important to be persistent without being annoying. So I'll give you 2 examples of that. One is last year, I was just trying to just gin up a little bit of business, and it was, I think, late January, and it was the Super Bowl weekend. And I know 30 people in Boston, where the Patriots are from, and I knew 30 people in Philadelphia. And I sent this same exact email to all 60 of them. I just pasted it into an email. I said, hey, thinking of you and the big game. I hope it goes your way. Have a great Super Bowl. And I would say of the 60 people I sent that to, probably 45 responded. And there was kind of a subliminal message in there like, hey, how's things going? And maybe we can do some deals. And there was one person who I had actually written off because I had tried to get in front of this guy several times, and just it became clear that nothing was going to happen. Ultimately, by sending that Super Bowl email, he's like, hey, by the way, now we have a deal and we want to do a deal with you. So, literally that took me 15 minutes to send those 60 emails. And of that, I was able to contact a number of people, keep the relationship warm, and at the same time, someone surfaced to potentially be interested in doing a deal. The other thing that I have done in the past is I have, which is actually quite a chore, is I have written what I consider to be a thoughtful New Year's note that, basically highlights something that has happened to me over the course of a year. Maybe it's travel. Maybe it was something impactful. Like last year, I went through a coaching regimen or a job change, whatever it might be. And I would write a kind of a 3-paragraph missive that I would literally send to 1,500 people. And then I would post on LinkedIn. So another 3, 4, 5,000 people would potentially see it, not that they all read it. And I would say that, I now get a lot of people that come up to me around December 1st, like, oh, I can't wait for your note. Can't wait for your note. And of the 1,500 people that I'm sending that to, I'd say a good 1,000 of them are saying, hey, Happy New Year to you. Hope you have a great year. We should get, not all of them, but like a good portion will say, hey, let's have coffee, or let's get a drink, or whatever it might be. So, I'm finding, or I have found ways to just kind of reach out and touch people in non-invasive ways that gives the perception, which is what I'm intending, that I care and I want to build that relationship. So Sarah has offered to, I think, post some readings that I recommend, and if you can, take a look at them. I'm a big fan of a book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. And the punchline is that givers, people that help other people, mentor other people, give of themselves, ultimately get ahead in the world over takers. It's a great book, certainly the first couple hundred pages, and a lot of it talks about networking. One of the things that I've been able to do is mentor a lot of different people, offering, free advice, or just whether it's mentoring or career advice or whatever it might be. And by doing that, I've been able to gain the confidence and trust of a number of people. And I think the more that you can be known as a trusted advisor, the more that you're able to be a go-to person in one particular area, the better. And at the same time, I am also known as a pretty good connector, where just last night I was at a cocktail party that was an alumni event for Northwestern, where I went to graduate school. And I met this young woman who's looking for a job, and I was able to connect her with 2 companies in Chicago, the venture capital firm that I'm sitting at right now, and 1 career coach, all in the space of about 15 minutes. Now, she has my card, and I would say there's a 50-50 chance that she'll follow up. If she's smart, she will, because I've opened the door to a number of different really good opportunities. And again, it's important to be following up if someone's making that offer. But networking is a 2-way street. If you just go about it with the attitude of give me business, give me business, give me business, give me, it doesn't work. I've been able to build hundreds, if not thousands, of relationships. And sometimes I've specced a lot of time, and sometimes it pays off, and sometimes it doesn't. But, I've been able to establish a number of relationships where, people think positively of me because I've done them a favor. I've helped their kid get an internship, whatever it might be, where, if I come calling and say, hey, I really need you because we're raising money. Hey, I really need you because I need to get into this orthodontist, or whatever it might be. It's not from an awkward place. It comes from, and that goes to the whole Adam Grant give and take philosophy. So I highly recommend that book. In terms of, sometimes you just don't know where things are going to be coming from. So as an example, when I was in business development, my biggest client was General Electric. Now, unfortunately, General Electric is falling on hard times, but for a smallish company to be able to get General Electric to become a client was a nice accomplishment and a good feather in our cap. And the way that came about was I helped a woman, which I've done dozens of, if not hundreds of times, who was looking for a job, and I'm known in Chicago as someone that's pretty helpful in the job search realm. I sat with her. I sat at a Starbucks, gave her an hour worth of advice, and then sent her a bunch of documents that I have. And she said, how can I help you? And again, 2-way street. How can I help you? And I said, I don't do it for that particular purpose. I want to see you be happy in your new job. And she insisted on introducing me. She was a former GE employee several years back, but she insisted on introducing me to her old boss, who was then at GE. she introduced us. We then struck up a relationship. We actually have become very good friends. And after doing a couple of deals together and doing him a big favor along the way, after a couple of years of knowing him, so again, this is like 3 years in the making. So these things don't happen overnight. After 3 years, he said, you know what, now that I understand you and what you do and blah, 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 I need to introduce you to these people in Connecticut. And he introduced me to the exact right person. You know, GE has 200,000 employees, and there were probably 3 of them that mattered to me in terms of the product I was selling. And he introduced me to the head of that group. I got in front of the head of that group, was able to win the account, and it all related to the fact that I was helping a person on a job search. Sears, which I had as a client, which everyone knows is unfortunately in bankruptcy, but that relationship was started on LinkedIn. The biggest piece of business I got at my old job, I got as a result of doing a seminar like this, where I went to a law firm and said, I'll do this thing on networking and business development, but I need to do a 10-minute commercial for my company first, which I did. And about a year later, one of the people in the audience called me up and said, hey, I remember your commercial. There's a deal that you guys may be interested in. And right now we're in the process, my old company at least is in the process of buying that deal. You just don't know where these things are coming from. And my network has played such an important role in terms of doing deals, establishing relationships, and getting access to people that I never would have had the hope of getting access to without being strategic, without being persistent, without being aggressive, and without trying to, kind of put all those pieces together. So one of the things I also talk about, and there's a book written by someone who's a Kellogg professor about storytelling and the power of storytelling in the context of business development. And I think it is important to have several arrows in your quiver of situations where you can demonstrate your bona fides as a means of getting people to say, wow, this person really knows what they're talking about. So my crowning achievement for GE was I was tasked with selling a number of their properties that were forgotten properties, one of which was a 1,000-acre gold mine in Eastern Oregon. And it had been owned by GE and on their books for 30 years, and no one could figure out what to do with it. And FDR had shut it down in 1942, and it was just sitting there. And I was bound and determined to sell that. And I literally knew 2 people in the state of Oregon, one of whom was a broker who I had done business with in a completely unrelated part of our business. And I called him up and I said, hey, do you know anyone that could help me to do this? And he said, yeah, you've got to call this guy, Jim Whitney. He owns ranches, he sells ranches, blah, blah, blah. The long and short of it is, once the permafrost came off this property in April 3 years ago, we were able to sell that property in 1 day as a result of me making 2 phone calls after having this property sit on the books of GE for 30 years. And I was able to do effectively another, the last bullet point, ports and puffery. I was able to sell another asset, which was a very difficult asset in Manzanillo, Mexico. And literally by having a series of meetings and finding the needle in the haystack person who could solve a problem for a big client, in this case it was USG. My client at USG had said, like, hey, if you can sell this property in 1 week, I will take care of you. And I was able to sell it in 3 days by making 1 phone call. And it's nice to have those resources to be able to call upon. So here's a list of some of the clients that I was working with. And the company that I came from didn't necessarily have the chops of a CBRE or a JLL. And I know there's some people from JLL on the phone. So it was like very much of a David and Goliath thing. So a lot of my business development really flowed from the fact that, people knew that I could help them solve their problem. They trusted me. And again, going back to that operational expertise, I knew what I was talking about in the sales process. Then a really important thing that I would like to talk about is a baseball term, which is hit them where they ain't. Trying to find venues and fishing ponds with little or no competition. So at my old company, It was very liquidation oriented and bankruptcy oriented. And there was an organization called the TMA. And I know there's some people from FTI on the phone who are familiar with that. And the TMA basically is a whole ecosystem around restructuring, liquidations, and the like. And my company was a giant player in that industry, or in that industry group, and was a big sponsor. And I always said, I do not want to be the 51st person from my company at a company sponsored event, because everyone knows the other 50 and they'll never form a relationship with me. I want to go somewhere else. So one of the stories I talk about, which is why these newspapers are here, is I had done a couple deals in the restructuring world, so in that TMA world, with newspapers that had gone bankrupt and then needed some help to get to the other side, and typically they had some excess real estate. So I did a couple deals in that space, and then after doing 2 deals, I said, maybe there's more newspaper folks that I can go after. And what I ended up doing was I ended up going online, and I saw that there were 2 organizations that had big conferences. One of them was called the Newspaper Association of America. And so I called up and I found out that I couldn't go because I wasn't Jimmy Olsen or Clark Kent, but I could sponsor for the same price, and then I could go. So I said, okay, let me sponsor a cocktail party. And literally at the very first breakfast event, the first day, I went into a room where there were 1,000 people there. I did not know a single soul, which, that's also something that becomes important, is the ability to walk into a room and start warming up relationships where you don't know anyone. And again, naturally shy, but I overcame it. And literally at the first breakfast I was telling someone about what I did, and 2 seats over from me was the CFO of a public company. And after him overhearing my conversation with a person who didn't really care, he leaned over to me and said, oh, by the way, we have a bunch of properties all over the country. Can you help us? So literally, I was the only real estate person in the room. And people would look at my badge and say, what are you doing here? And then I say, don't you have a lot of excess real estate because of the state of the industry? And they say, come to think of it, I do. You should meet our CFO. You should meet our COO. And over the course of a couple of years, I literally became the real estate person of the newspaper industry. And what I did was I spoke on panels. I wrote articles. So I became synonymous with the real estate of newspapers. And ultimately, that wasn't a great vein of business, but it's a good demonstration of I never had competition, ever. I was the only real estate person. And, by going to several industry events and ultimately meeting the 5 business brokers, anytime there was a deal, they called me. Within a year, I had formed a relationship with these 5 people that were seeing every different deal where real estate would be falling off the cart, and created a nice niche. So a couple different comments here. A lot of people just follow the herd. A lot of people go to cocktail parties and the like and just talk with their friends. That's, you can talk to your friends, but you should spend 2 minutes with them and make plans to meet another time. It's more important to find people you don't know. It's more important. And there's a trick to, and I call it the badge trick, of just trying to see, like, if you're looking for industrial players and you're walking around and you see someone from Dairy Queen, you may not talk to that person. But if you see the next person's got a badge that says General Electric, you may want to engage that person in conversation. Going back to the newspaper scenario at that first breakfast, I noticed that the person in front of me in line had a badge that said, so-and-so from Augusta, Georgia. And of course, everyone knows, or a lot of people who play golf know, that the Masters is held, and that's in Georgia, at Augusta, Georgia. So I made a comment like, hey, by the way, I see that you're from Augusta. Have you ever played there? It turned out this guy was like a member. He had 10 green jackets, all this other stuff. So simply because I saw that his badge said Augusta, I was able to start a conversation, a meaningful conversation, and ultimately they didn't become a client, but I did end up in discussions with their COO about selling some of their real estate. Lastly, on this page is what I call bootstrapping the banks. And once you're able to get some credibility with a particular client, like I was able to land a client through persistence and a relationship, which was a nice mid-sized bank in Chicago. Then I was able to go to other banks and say, hey, by the way, I'm working with Bank A, which should give you a sense of my legitimacy. And that was able to then parlay me into bank B, which actually came through LinkedIn. And then A and B led me to C. And then all of a sudden I became a bank real estate expert, and I was able to go to Chase and Bank of America and all these big folks. And even though it was a David and Goliath sort of situation, we were able to get business by being able to say, hey, GE is a client. Hey, BMO Harris is a client. Hey, this one is a client, and build your credibility through your client base. So we're getting close to the end. I know Sarah has a couple questions, and some of the other, I'll quickly go through these last three. So how do you organize all this? I would keep a list of people that were in my network, literally stratified, A, B, C, and D. And then my list became so long that I never, ever spent time with C's and D's. And part of this is like, it's nice to have friends, but if the object is business development, it's who is going to give me business, who is most likely to give me business, who's a past customer that may give me business, and who's likely to give me repeat business. So there are people that are just, the prime targets. And I would try to be in touch with them. If I had 50 on that list, I would try to be in touch with every single one of them on some level every month or 6 weeks. And then the Bs, of which I probably had a couple hundred, I would probably try to get in touch with them once a quarter. And again, birthdays, events, sporting events, whatever it might be where you can get yourself in front of them, even if it's just a nice note, you're staying in front of people. Again, focus on the A's more than the B's. It's an organic process. So today's C, there may be someone who's just sort of hanging around, but all of a sudden they became a client, and all of a sudden they become a big client. Then they move into the A category. I've had A's turn into C's. So it's, a network is something that is to be thought about, is to be groomed, is to be grown, and is to be tended like a garden. Then I would say, a really important thing, and this is true in job search as well as in networking and business development, is the notion of connectors. And I think, if you read that book, Give and Take by Adam Grant, I call these people either connectors or clusters. And these are people that are really well networked and are willing to help you. And over the last 5 years, I've found that there were, probably a dozen to 24 people in my network who were situated like this, who they themselves had great networks. And we had just a mutual network sharing arrangement where, as an example, I have a friend who is in marketing. And whenever I would come across, whether in my charitable endeavors, whether in my investing endeavors, whether in my day job, whatever it might have been, if I came across someone that could use marketing help, I would feed this person to my friend Steve. Likewise, if Steve, found someone in some of his investments or in some of his marketing companies that needed a real estate hand, that would come my way. And I was able to build up a network. So, there's people who just are, I'll call them A primes on the ABC list. People that I stay in touch with, that I'm basically very friendly with all of them. We see the world the same way. We're very much givers. And we've been able to establish a rapport and an ability to pass business back and forth and to get ourselves into situations like, again, my friend Steve has a dinner that is food oriented or food investment oriented. And just because we're pals and some of those guys may have real estate needs, that was my old job, he would invite me to every one of those dinners. And if I could do the same sort of thing, whether finding him investors or whatever it might be. So, I'm always trying to think, and you should always be trying to think about, who are these connectors? Can I get into a web of connectors? Because, if you're able to find like-minded networking groups, like, again, I'll use Steve as an example. He brought me into the world of food investing, and I've since invested in a number of different food startups. And it's really all because he introduced me to the area. I took a liking to it, and now I'm kind of his equal in terms of having quite an extensive network in the food world. And then last point on this is just, I have, dozens and dozens of business friends. And, there's a lot of folks who just have these superficial relationships. I've been able to transition from, business friends to real friends, and that, and they become trusted advisors or on your personal board of directors or however you want to call it. But, to the extent that you can deepen the relationship, and cross the line into actual friends, great. That's been a big benefit. So I've made a lot of great friends as a result of, being out there. And I think the second to last page here, is, in terms of, we've talked about being a good listener. If you're familiar with the movie Groundhog Day and Ned Ryerson, it's important to have both an IQ, be smart about things, and an EQ, be able to read a person, read a situation, read a room. And, rushing up to Bill Murray and saying, buy insurance, in my view, doesn't work. As I've said before, the best business development people that I've run into are people that just really know their stuff operationally, nuts and bolts. They're effectively selling excellence, and they're selling the product without even selling it by just demonstrating that they know what they're talking about and that they can give good advice. And they're not overly aggressive in the Ned Ryerson sort of way. Again, want to reemphasize the value of warm introductions, the value of storytelling, and being crafty and being aggressive. And one last little story is, sometimes you go to a conference and you'll meet 5 or 10 people, but you don't meet them all. I've been to events where at the end of the event where I've met, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, but I know that there's 200 there and it's a room full of quote unquote good targets. And I'll go over, and, sometimes they give you the attendee list, but in a lot of cases they don't. And I've done things where I've just kind of glanced at the attendee list, looked at who's going to be there or looked who has been there, and then write down, here are the 10 people that I'm going to reach out to. And then after the event say, hey, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet at XYZ conference. Would have been great. I thought it was a great conference, blah, blah, blah. Love to, meet in person, yada, yada, yada. And I've done that before where I didn't meet anyone, but then I sent, 30 follow-up emails to complete strangers saying, hey, we shared this experience. Wish we could have gotten together. What do you say? And I've gotten some really nice deals and some really nice relationships out of, that bit of aggressiveness or craftiness. So I know we got about 10 minutes, and I wanted to be able to take some questions that Sarah's going to feed to me. Here's my contact information. I'd suggest, I'm happy to connect with you guys on LinkedIn. There's my personal email address. And then just a couple tips especially for the younger people. One, know what's going on in the world, read newspapers or read whatever sources will get you information about what's going on in the world, because if you're going to be a conversationalist, it's important to understand more than just sports and social media. Two, it's important to have, obviously a firm handshake, good eye contact, be dressed well, be presentable, those sorts of things. And I think there's a generational shift where the younger generation spends a lot of time on social media, on email, on texting, and people will text versus call, or they won't talk to people. And I think, those of you who are on the phone who know how to talk, which you all do, I would say the personal touch wins out over the world that a lot of you guys live in, which is I'll send a text. I don't need to talk to this person. I can't tell you how important it is to pick up the phone or walk down the hall and to face, because that's what helps build a relationship much more than texting and doing those sorts of things. Don't mean to lecture, but I just think in my experience, it's been much more important to be able to establish a relationship through human contact over electronic means. So with that, Sarah, I finished on time, and I'm ready for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. So at this point, we'll take about 8 minutes of Q&A. So in your GoToWebinar toolbar under that question tab, that's where you can submit your questions. And David, we did get a couple during your talk. So the first one is from Chase, and he would like to know how to boil down your skill set for a short elevator pitch, like you mentioned, when you have such a non-linear background.
How I do it or how to do it? I mean, I think it's important for a person to really understand themselves and be honest with themselves in terms of what their strong suits are, what their weaknesses are, et cetera. And it's hard for a lot of people to look in the mirror and say, hey, I'm mediocre at this, or I suck at that, or whatever it might be. But it's really, really, really important in both business development and also in getting jobs to know yourself, to know your skill set, to think about it, to boil it down. And there's one piece of advice that I would give in this case, which goes to job searches as well as to networking, which is a document that I call a hero document, which is think about 5 or 10 situations that you've been in your life where here's the situation, here's what I did about it, here's the result, and here's the skills that it demonstrates. And having those stories at the ready will help both in an interview context and in the context of potentially winning business. But ultimately, it's really having a good awareness of your skills and asking other people, what do you think I'm strong at? What do you think I'm not so strong at? And being able to hawk the things that are your strengths.
That's great. Thank you. So another question just came in about how do you draw out someone that has a reserved personality? So maybe someone who isn't inclined to engage or is somewhat introverted, but you would like to do business with them.
Yeah, so that becomes difficult, and there are some conversations you just have to leave because someone's never leaving the cocoon. But it goes back to listening and getting a person to talk about. Again, you can talk topically about what's going on in the world. In a lot of cases, you're walking into a conversation and like, oh, you want to talk about the Cubs? Oh yeah, I went to a Cubs game the other day. So in a lot of cases, it's just really getting people to talk. Again, the point about reading the newspaper, it's always easy putting politics aside to say, to bring something up like that is happening. Like, oh, hey, there's an election today. I know that's politics, but just, something that's in the news, in the front page of the news, like, oh, did you see that, what LeBron did? And can you believe that, that whole thing with Tiger? And that's why I think reading the newspaper, seeing things that are topical, knowing what's going on in the world. And, if you see someone that's reserved and you see that they're, wearing a badge that says GE on it, well, if you've been reading the newspaper or you're aware, that GE is being broken apart and their stock is in the crapper. You can basically commiserate with the person and say, hey, gee, I know you guys are going through a tough time. What's it like? How is it at GE? What's the morale like? And, you get them talking about something that, is of interest and people are generally aware of.
That's great. And that also addresses, we had another question come in while you're saying that said, do you have any go-to questions you'd recommend to help spark conversation when networking? But I think a lot of what you just talked about, so, being up to date, really reading the news and making sure that you know what's going on and can bring that up with people. But is there anything that you'd want to add about specific questions that you have that help people open up and get the conversation going?
It's very situational, and sometimes these things are more social than others, and sometimes there's alcohol involved. So the more alcohol that's involved, the conversation seems to change. Sometimes you're walking into a conversation, you're listening for cues, and you're seeing where you can step in and add something. In other cases, again, going back to the badge that I talked about with this guy Billy from Augusta, sometimes it's as simple as like I'm in Los Angeles right now, and I was at a party last night, and someone said like, oh, you're from Chicago too? And, we had where do you live in Chicago? And, so like, just sometimes it's just the badge or the company that they work for or the event that you're at or, what's happening in the newspaper. And there's just, there's a million ways to start a conversation. It's just, you gotta either walk into it or pick one and see if someone can go and just get them talking a little bit. And then you can then steer the conversation to, hey, maybe we can get coffee one day, or a topic that, gets them to say what's some of the pain, in an initial conversation, they may not tell you what the pain that they're suffering that you can help them with. But it's more just getting a conversation going, putting a placeholder down and then trying to get yourself to a second meeting if you think that it's going to be worthwhile, if this person is going to be an A or a B. And then following up, as I mentioned, with an email or a call or a text. And then, and I would tickle things. I would if I was going to do something with Sarah, we met at a cocktail party and I wanted to follow up because I wanted to do this webinar. I would send you an email and I would put a tickler in there to say, okay, if Sarah doesn't get back to me in 2 weeks, I'm going to then send her yet another email saying, hey, haven't heard back from you. Would love to do that webinar, blah, blah, blah. At that point, I may give up, but I had a whole system or have a whole system of just trying to go from that initial conversation of just getting a connection and using that connection to then try to grow into a relationship.
That makes perfect sense. So it looks like we're coming towards the end of our time together. Are there any last tips or takeaways that you want to share, David, before we wrap up?
So give to Emory. I think the alumni group does a really good job, and I can tell you just one quick story of just using the power of your network. And in this case, in my old job, I was doing business in Mexico and mostly in Mexico City, completely foreign country, obviously. I had zero relationships or maybe one relationship. And I asked one of my coaches for a suggestion. He said, why don't you just go on I went to Kellogg for business school. Why don't you go on the Kellogg LinkedIn page for Mexico City? And there were 30 Kellogg grads who are on this one page or in this one group, and there's a lot of groups out there that you can join. And I literally just emailed all 30 of them, said, hey, I'm doing business down there, blah, blah, blah. And I would say that I got 15 responses and probably 8 meetings. And in 2 cases, it almost led to deals. It never actually led to any commerce, but simply by just, being, resourceful, thinking, how can I connect with people using, hey, we both went to Kellogg. I mean, that's an important thing when you're reaching out to people like, hey, I have a special place in my heart for Emory grads and Northwestern grads. And so, play that card like, hey, I see that you went to Emory. I went to Emory too. You like Atlanta? Do you not like Atlanta? Blah, blah, blah. And, just try to find connection points, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's in a conversation, whether it's a situation that you're in, trying to find that connection that you can then use to then build a greater connection, to build a relationship that ultimately, if you're in it for the business development, can lead to transactions and a business relationship.
Thank you, David. And I swear we didn't pay you for that plug for Emory, but I appreciate it. So first, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of this hard-earned business development and networking advice for us today. For everyone who's fired up and ready to practice the tips that David shared, I want to remind you that Emory's Office of Alumni Engagement hosts regular networking events, some of which David referenced, and career programming both online and in major cities all around the world. So you can find out more about those and get involved on our website, which is alumni.emory.edu/career calendar, all one word. So as a reminder, I'm going to email out everyone a link to today's recording. I'm also going to include the attachment with some additional reading that David has shared. And David's contact information also is on the slide here if you have any further questions. So thank you so much, David, for all your time and advice today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for listening. And good luck out there.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.